So let's start. I think this special session, which has two parts, we would like to discuss the whole question, which is very important, I think, now in this current summit, which will be discussed now, is the question about on 2% of gross domestic product military spending. As you probably know already, it's a target the NATO has decided on, NATO leaders has decided on in 2014 in Wales. And as you know, probably only 5 countries for the moment have 2% or more. So most countries are below. And if you translate this, just to give you this information, I don't want to take what you want to say, but it's equal for Europe. If you implement it today, it will be 130 billion euros. It's quite a lot of money for European NATO countries altogether. So I think it's very important to discuss it, because at this current summit they will try to make a real concrete plan with limited, with a date limit to have this target reached. And just to inform you, this week in a famous Belgian magazine, Flemish-speaking magazine, there was a long interview with Stoltenberg, and he was very clear on it that each country should stick to this 2%. Even if you try to get to it, even if it's 1.7, it's not enough, it should be 2%. That's what he said. Okay, so for the panel, we will have some introductions, and of course, after the introductions, we invite you to participate in discussions. I have to excuse Jordi Calvo, who mailed me 2-3 days ago that he couldn't come. He was not able to come, so we have only 2 panelists. And the first panelist is Ingeborg Breines. She's from Norway, but she's a global woman as well, I guess. From the International Peace Bureau. You can explain a little bit more what you're doing and what you're working on. And the second speaker is Tobias Flüger from Germany. He's a former member of European Parliament, and one of his special interests is, of course, the connection between the European Union and NATO, and in this case, probably interesting also to see how it reflects into the military spending discussion. So, brief introductions, please, just to give kind of general view, because in the second part, in the special session, we will more look into particular situations in countries, how we can deal with it as a peace movement, strategies and actions. Okay, so Ingeborg, you start.
Thank you. I actually thought I would make a small introduction and then speak about Norway, and in the last session speak about the measures that we need to take. So maybe I'll do it that way with your permission, because I think the last thing we do together should be to come up with strategies as to what to do in the future. So I think we are here mainly to sharpen our non-violent tools and to deepen our understanding and strengthen our cooperation and our friendship, so as to be that peace force for a transformative shift, presenting alternatives to the insane, dangerous and naive thinking that inequality, injustice, insecurity and marginalization can be solved by military means. We are here, I think, to develop together the strategies to stop this basically imperialistic thinking that if you want peace, you have to prepare for war. That is the old Roman slogan that we don't need anymore. So this is old-fashioned, it is patriarchal way of insisting on the importance of having strong muscles and being militarily strong, which is actually a sign of moral and creative weakness. If you want peace, and most men and most women do, we have to prepare for peace and use our financial and intellectual resources accordingly. Excessive military expenditure not only represented theft from those who are hungry and suffer, but are also an ineffective means of obtaining human security and a culture of peace. So substantial reduction of the military costs would eliminate the crushing poverty whereby nearly 1/3 of humanity lives in insufferable conditions, the majority being women and children. So the International Peace Bureau has suggested a 10% reduction in military costs to benefit the new UN development agenda with its 17 sustainable development goals. These would be 10% per year over the 15 years of the agenda. That would not change the present power imbalances, but that would be a discussion once we have done that 10% per year reduction. And if you compare the $1.7 trillion that the world is presently spending on the military, according to the official figures of SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, that corresponds to some 615 years of the UN regular budget. So when we have established the UN to help solve crisis, to prevent wars from happening, even though there might be conflicts of interest, we need to move the money from the military sector to the UN, and in particular to this new UN development agenda. And what is happening now is that both rich and poor countries are pressured into an arms race and spending much more on armament that they both need and can afford. So if we continue a process of militarization, which is often outside also democratic control, it mainly serves the arms producers and dealers and bring corruptions and dangerous path that will not bring hope to the young people in desperation, but might lead, as we have heard so many times, to extremism. And it is incredible for many of us that this is not heard by the main policy makers. So, to us, it is no way to justify war, killing, and suffering. So we have, in a way, to choose between warfare and welfare, to use the words of the International Peace Bureau. And it is actually a question of survival. It is both an economic and an environmental question. If you look at the economic question, it is obvious, but the other that we need to shift the money. But the environmental issue is equally important because the military is the biggest polluter in the world. It uses natural resources, it uses energy for the war industry itself, for the keeping of the weapons, for the testing of the weapons, not to speak about the environmental damage of war. So there is a social and there is an economic and there is an environmental aspect that is so strong that we can say that if we do not manage to stop this militarization process and confrontation, which is actually driven, as we see it, by NATO, there is a risk that we won't have a planet to live on. This decision that the NATO countries should spend 2% of their GDP on the military country, who over so many years have seen its security based to being a friendly country with solidarity for those in need, and a country that was putting emphasis on the importance of the UN. So you will be disappointed to hear that Norway now is a particularly strong NATO supporter and US ally, and not least under the present conservative and ultra-conservative government. So, in addition to the conservatives' very strong belief in the military, the country is presently in a double bind because, as you know, Jens Stoltenberg was a previous Norwegian prime minister, social democrat, popular, young, good-looking, and many people say that when Stoltenberg is in NATO, it cannot be that bad. This was a huge PR scoop by NATO at the outset, at least. He seems to be changing. And I fear that if we haven't managed to close down NATO by the time that Stoltenberg finishes his mandate, the next scoop of the NATO would be to have a woman Secretary General. And since women over the centuries have been those that have been the caring gender, taking care of the old and the sick, and peace-loving and anti-militaristic, that would really be too bad. So in connection with the upcoming elections in September, the Norwegian Peace Council made a poll, and we were totally shocked to hear that only 5% of the Norwegian people wants to get out of NATO. They were not asked if they wanted to close down, but they were asked if Norway should quit NATO. This doesn't seem, however, to be in accordance with the impression that I've had from a series of talks that I've done around the country, and where people have been so eager to hear about alternatives to these so-called military solutions. And there is a trying to put Russia as an enemy of Norway, whilst we over many years have had excellent cooperation with Russia, particularly in the north, for the survival actually of the Arctic people living in both countries, where they needed each other in different times. So the people seem to be influenced by the official rhetoric and the mainstream media just echoing this official rhetoric. Of course, terror and the misguided war on terror is also playing a significant role in the shaping of people's opinions. The government has, of course, I would say, promised that they would reach the goal of 2% of GDP for military purposes very quickly, and they have already made huge steps in this direction. A white paper that was recently presented gave rise to debate, but hardly related to the enormous economic, social, and environmental cost, but on what kind of military did we want to have. Should we have a traditional country-based military with strong civilian component, guarding in particular the long coast, or a military that would answer to NATO's need in its out-of-area operations and war? And a stronger Norwegian NATO connection it will be. That was the end result. We are buying 52 Joint Strike Fighters, F-35, that will mainly be based in the middle of the country, where US already has significant depots of military equipment, and where recently we have gotten a US base for the first time with some 330 soldiers. So the map of the US bases around the world is now with the bases that are around Russia, coming up to 100 bases all in all. Having foreign troops based on Norwegian soil is against Norwegian previous policy, and the peace movement is naturally up in arms. Norway is also buying surveillance planes and submarines and accepting new and stronger spy satellite stations in the north that gives data directly to the US. And a Norwegian committee consisting of military researchers from the US and Norway will present recommendation later this year whether Norway should be part of the missile shield system, which is of course strongly contested by Russia. Or they say we would need a shield of our own. Although NATO troops have been training in Norway also previously, there has never been training before in Finnmark, which is the area where we have the border with Russia. Now recently we had 8,000 troops training there, and there is much more to come. Both the military base and the provoking training in the far north constitute, of course, a serious break with Norwegian former military policies, and it happens without proper military discussions and decisions. And the government dropped out of a series of meetings on the humanitarian effects of the use of nuclear weapons, although that round of discussions started in Oslo, and they do not participate in the new negotiations on the ban of the atomic bomb due to NATO membership. Our previous parliamentary committees on defense and on foreign affairs have been merged, entailing a much stronger security aspect on foreign relations and even on development cooperation. And as of this year, Norway has gotten so-called gender-neutral military service for both girls, obligatory for both girls and boys, although only 1/3 of the cohort is presently needed. And to legitimize all of this, of course, there is a strong focus on developing enemies. And I think the crisis in Ukraine came in very handy, because the critique of the NATO operations in one country after the other, creating havoc and misery and people on the run in so many Muslim countries, NATO needed an enemy that was closer. So the Ukraine it came exactly when it was needed somehow. So later I will speak about the Arctic Council, which I think is a very important body to counter the present strong tensions. And I will also, in the next round, give you my suggested 8 points as to why we have to close down NATO quickly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ingeborg. I give the floor to Tobias. Tobias, I understood you also, I forgot to say it, talk about the situation in Greece, which is an interesting example, I think.
Mainly, I want to speak about what does it mean, this 2% GDP for the different member states of NATO. I will speak about what does it mean for Germany as one of the 5 big players inside NATO. One remark before this: In Germany we have always a debate that after the Brexit vote and after Trump was elected, there was the wish from the new administration of the United States to have this 2% of GDP for military budget. This is not true, because the decision was very early. I looked in some of the papers. The first debates about this 2% was 2009, and the formally decision was on the Warsaw Summit. And in the Warsaw Summit they said it should be 2% of GDP or of all member states what they spend for military budget. For the Trump debate this is important because they try a little bit to say, oh, we are not able to do it, but it's necessary because this terrible new US administration. No, they decided in the Warsaw Summit, together with all other member states of NATO, that they want this 2% in the budget of military spending. In the moment we have in Germany a military budget of 35.3 billion euro, and they bring it to 37 billion euro this year, so it's 8% more than before. And what is very interesting is that it is 10% more in this part which they use for investing, special for investing in weapons. That's important because that shows what will happen when they increase the military budget. In Germany they have decided that the army, which have 180,000 soldiers in the moment, they will bring it to 200,000. And they will buy a lot of new weapons. And also what is very interesting, they rebuy a lot of old weapons. For example, they buy 700 old tanks back to the army, so that they have them more than before. And also they have a lot of new programs for tanks, for combat helicopters, for fighter jets, and so on. And there is a big program going on for buying new weapons. And then you have something like a circulation. And this always is important when we speak about export of weapons. Because some say the debate about export of weapons it's only a moral question. Yes, it is. But it is also so that when the armies buy weapons for their use, one more part is used for export. We see it in all projects, what the Bundeswehr, the German army is doing, that they always buy, for example, tanks, airplanes, and so on, and the same number they try to export in other states, especially in the Near East, in the Middle East, and so it's always something like a circulation. When you spend more money, you have more weapons for the different armies, and you have more weapons for export. When I look to the different numbers from the NATO member states, what they spend for military budget, in the United States it's nearby 4%. It's a huge number when you compare it with all other states on the world. And inside NATO, it's only Great Britain and Greece and Estonia, which Poland is now coming to 2%, which have 2% or more. France and Turkey are nearby, 2%, And I think it's terrible that something like a state like Greece has such a big military budget. In the same time, there is the diktat for social cutting from European Union and other players in Greece, and we also see it that when the German finance minister, you know him, this terrible guy, Wolfgang Schäuble, he says, in this field we are able to pay more money, in this field for military budget. But they are not able, for example, to pay more money for social questions or something like this. But in this field it's possible. And when you look to the situation inside the European Union, it's terrible, because you have the economy of Germany who destroys with its exports all the neighbor states, and nevertheless they will have a lot of spending in this military field. So what is very funny, the General Secretary from NATO, your wonderful Social Democrat Stoltenberg, says to the German Social Democrats, don't do a disarmament election campaign. And I checked before what the Social Democrats, what is the position now, because they change it nearby every day. What is the position now to 2% from the Social Democrats? In the moment they discuss, because the Sigmar Gabriel, the new foreign minister, says it's a little bit too much. It's a little bit too much. So perhaps it's not possible so soon to have this 2%. And what I think, I'm also vice president of the party Die Linke, I think that we as peace movement and Die Linke have to do something like a real disarmament election campaign. We have to say, cut all this money for military spending and say no to this 2% for the military budget. We have a lot of arguments, because it means more wars, it means more military missions. They will bring more soldiers, for example, to Afghanistan. And it also means more export of weapons. It also means more production of new weapons. And the military industrial complex will be stronger than before. That was my experience here in Brussels, and it's always when I'm coming to Brussels I'm thinking back to this, because I was a member of the Subcommittee Security and Defense, and a lot of military lobbyists are going in and out there, and there's a big military business here in Brussels. And it will also the situation that also inside European Union the military spending will be more than before. And the funny thing is that in the moment they have a closer NATO-European Union cooperation, and they try to organize the military structures inside the European Union more effective than before. Now you have a new headquarter from the European Union, what is outside of NATO. Since now it was inside NATO, now it's outside NATO, it's absolutely independent from NATO, so we have two developments, a stronger military European Union and a stronger NATO. And for a geopolitical player than Germany, they play both inside European Union and inside NATO. And finally, I think it's one central question for the peace movement to say this 2% is the total wrong answer, and what is necessary is to have a disarmament in all fields, from small weapons to nuclear weapons, and to fight for this and say NATO with this 2% decision is something like a war machine, and to dissolve NATO and to fight against these NATO structures. And for me personally, in the morning I've seen first time this Donald Trump personally, because I have had the same situation than our friend from Great Britain. I wasn't able to come here because all was closed, and he really was something like this to the people. I do not show what I have done. I have done a little bit like this.
Here you can show it.
So I think he's something like a symbol in his policy, but in reality we have to fight against the structures of NATO, which are this who makes able all the wars, and we have to fight against it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias. Since we have also translation, so we need a micro if some of you want to intervene. Maybe first questions you have, real questions in the sense that you need more information on a certain subject. And if not, then you can also give comments and whatever has been said. I will be a walking moderator now. So, who wants to? Yeah?
Cindy is helping us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name is Lonneke de Mere. I'm originally from the anti-racist movement in the Netherlands, especially in Amsterdam, where we started 1.5 years ago a small group of activists against war, named the Initiative Group in Amsterdam Against War. So this whole issue for me is rather new, not totally, but rather new. I would like to know from the people from Norway and Germany if you make connection between more militarization and the issue of the refugees coming from the countries who suffer so much from war. I was very impressed by the speech of Mas Salim just half an hour ago. And she makes this connection. That is what we try to do in Holland also. The connection between militarization and the question of refugees. And then, when you go on, you make a connection to racism. Because I think these things, they have a lot of things in common, and you always have to do it together in your... So it's just, I want to know if that is the issue in Norway and in Germany or maybe somebody else.
Okay, thank you. Maybe take a second question or comment. Je m'excuse, c'est difficile. C'est grand salle pour peu du monde.
Tom Crilly, I'm a member of the Peace and Neutrality Alliance in Ireland, and we, something similar to the development that's happening in Norway, that what was traditionally a neutral country is becoming more kind of embracing militarism. The big issue we have is the US landing at Shannon Airport. Over the last 15 years, over 2.5 million US military troops have passed through Shannon on their way to various imperialist wars in the Middle East, and also our troops, our own Irish troops are getting very much involved in the battle groups as well, and for training and getting involved in the structure. But just all of what really was a question, like you mentioned that if the combined NATO countries, EU NATO countries, were to spend 2%, you gave a figure, was that 130 billion? And could you? So I wanted that figure. Like what would the combined spending be? And also, what countries have actually? You mentioned Greece, Estonia, Poland. Is there 6 countries that actually have come up to the 2%? I just didn't get that. The 6 countries. Thanks.
Maybe, third question.
Thank you. I'm Claudia, coming from Germany and also member of the Executive Board of the European Left Party. My question to you is the reasons which are given why we need this armament. Okay, Trump wants, the European leaders want the armament themselves, but they have to convince the people. So how do they do it? By pointing to Russia as an enemy, by pointing to terrorism? What's the discussion in your countries?
Take 4 and then the second round. Is that okay? Else it will be too much. Okay.
Bert de Belder from the Workers' Party of Belgium, PTB. On the 2% issue, is it just, this is a question for information, is it just the 2% or does it come with directives on what to spend it on, what kind of armament, has it to be incorporated, integrated in the NATO structures and the NATO types of armament? Or could it be also 2% to spend on human security, on a completely alternative way of securing society from any external threats and dangers? And a second question, do we have any information or results on how secure people feel in relation to the height of the military budget? Are there opinion polls? A poll was mentioned on Norway, which was a rather not so nice result, but are there any polls or any research has done on how secure a society can feel with a lower military budget or with a military budget that has been spent in an alternative way outside of NATO impositions?
Okay. Maybe I just answered because yeah, it's okay. We do the second round. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. It will be very short. Okay. I'm Greek and I always participate in the European left. I want just to add something that first of all, the 1/3 of our debt is due to military spending. And you understand what does it mean for our country. Secondly, I want to say that from 2006 to 2015, because of the crisis, we reduced to 35% our military spending in Greece, and now we will be obliged to spend more because of this decision of NATO, and we understand how difficult it is for a country in crisis and where there are also refugees. And at the same time, I want to say that the situation is difficult because Turkey now it's in difficulty in the Middle East. The tension becomes high, so they press us. You understand that we are in a difficult situation with our relations with Turkey. That's what I want to say.
Okay, let's take these questions. I just gonna answer because I mentioned 130 billion in my introduction. It's my own calculations according to the figures that NATO is giving. If you go to the website of NATO, you will find tables of every year with military spending. And so also Stoltenberg mentioned in this interview that in 2016 was the first year that we not only stopped the decrease of military spending, so-called peace dividend, but that now most countries are on the path of increasing military spending. And so if you calculate combined percentages on GDP and what should be done, so towards the 2%, I calculate 130 billion euros. I checked, it's 5 countries now. Tobias mentioned Poland reached the 2% last year. And now, in this interview, Stoltenberg said Romania and 2 other countries, I think the Baltic countries as well, are almost there. Especially Romania is a special case as well, because its infrastructure, for example, is really bad, to say something. Okay. I don't know if you don't have to answer all questions, just maybe those you think, in your experience.
I think the first question related to whether the militarization could be linked to the refugee situation and also to racism. And it is, of course, not linked by the official statements in no way. But the peace movement is trying to say that if you keep with your weapons out of these countries, the refugees might keep out of our countries, which would be an obvious comparison to make. But having the official political establishment understand this relation or accept to deal with that relation doesn't seem to be an easy issue. When it comes to racism, it is not being debated, and I would actually think, but it might be hard to say, that the military system does not look that much into racism. They use their weapons wherever they can profit from testing them and from selling them, sorry to say. To neutrality, and it is so sad that we have so few countries left that are neutral countries. We do need that inspiration or model thinking for other countries. So I'm just sad to hear that Ireland also feel that they are going the same way as Norway. And I heard you use the word that your soldiers are training groups in Syria or Iraq, and training is of course a much nicer word to have accepted by the public than fighting a war in these countries, which is actually what they are doing. The question of disarmament is almost a taboo question in the UN system. And the Conference on Disarmament that was established to deal with disarmament in Geneva has over the 19 last years not been able to work. So I think that the fact that we have a new Secretary General in the UN that puts so much emphasis, Mr. Guterres, on the prevention of violent conflict and war and on disarmament, that we should play on this new interest. Ban Ki-moon said that the world is overarmed, that peace is underfunded, but he wasn't a strong promoter of disarmament. So maybe we should go back and ask the UN to have a new special session on disarmament in the General Assembly of the UN, because the Security Council, we know their limits. So insisting on a political insistence on having a session on security where we are able to develop what do we mean by disarmament and how can we build up human security as we reduce the so-called military security. I think that would be very, very important. Because when it comes to Norway, there is no specification from NATO as to what weaponry we should buy, but indirectly it is in the sense that we want to be useful in a NATO context, and we buy the weapons that are not to protect, if need be, our shores, the long coast, but to be effective elsewhere, wherever NATO wants in their out-of-area strategy to attack preemptively, as they say, to avoid to have the wars on our ground. Do people feel secure? When UNDP made the Human Development Report, that is, to me at least, the biggest report I've ever seen on what makes people feel secure. And there you have a long presentation of food security, street security, environmental security, security to have education, to live decently, to have a job. All that is human security. And Norway was, with Canada, in the forefront of developing the human security concept with the Lysøen Declaration. So that is the only research I've seen on this. So it is very sad that the media and the political establishment is making people so fearful that they think that the human security is not enough, they would need a military security. And I think this is one of the main issues that we need to deal with. And why do we need all these arms? I mean, there are so many arguments for not needing these arms. So I think we could develop them, but it's said to be necessary to fight the enemy. And in order to have enemies, you have to define somebody as enemy, and you make up the reasoning for why they are enemies. So that will be my answers.
So the question about the connection between refugee question and this military spending question, I think you can see it very directly in Turkey. I've been there several times, and Turkey army use German weapons to destroy Kurdish cities, Cizre and all this, and they use German weapons to intervene in Syria and be part of the war there. And when they destroy the cities, the people which live there have no more possibility to live there, and they will be refugees. The most of them are inside Turkey, but some of them also ask for asylum in Germany. So the German weapons are used so that at the end the people have to ask for asylum. It's very direct, it's an obvious situation, and you have this situation in a lot of cases. So one main point is to stop export of weapons, and this is only possible to stop export of weapons when you stop the production of weapons. So it's absolutely clear we have to say it's not allowed to make the production of weapons. And there's also a lot of connection with racism. in the moment, perhaps you know the debate about the German army and their connection to a lot of groups. We have some, how do I call it, terrorist soldiers. Meanwhile, they have 7 which are clear they are right-wing planning terrorist attacks, and they have learned how to handle with weapons inside the German army. One of the reactions of the German defense minister, a woman, was to say there should be no connection with the former Wehrmacht. Unfortunately, when you look to this German army, it's nearby impossible, because a lot of the housings there are former Wehrmacht buildings. There is a lot of tradition from Wehrmacht to Bundeswehr and all this, and clear, a lot of right-wing groups want to go to military structures to learn there. So we have a lot of cases of racism inside army, and it's not wondering, it's logical. So there is also this direct connection. And the question to the neutral states, I think it's very important, because meanwhile the so-called neutral states, Finland, Sweden, Ireland and Austria, are part of European Union, and European Union is meanwhile also a military institution. The Lisbon Treaty, since the Lisbon Treaty, you have a solidarity clause, you have a lot of military structures inside the European Union, and it's also another military institution, NATO, European Union and so on. And so it's nearby impossible to be neutral inside a military institution. And also all these states are states which are participating in Partnership for Peace of NATO. So they have common maneuvers and exercises and all this. And they, what you have said before, there are a lot of education military missions. And these education military missions are the new way for influencing, for example, in Afghanistan, officially it's an education military mission. Bullshit. It's absolutely clear what they do there. They educate the police and the military of Afghanistan to act like in Western interest. And what I've heard 2 days ago, it is that they take some of these Afghan police, they bring it here, the Afghan police, and together with them, they bring the refugees to Afghanistan. It's unbelievable. They say it's a secure country, and they expel the people there, and in the same time they say it's totally unsecure, so we need troops there. It's not very logical in this argumentation. About the military bases, Shannon is one of them, and the United States, NATO and European Union, and the different member states of NATO and European Union create a lot of military bases all over the world. And we know, for example, the drone war from the former US President Obama and the new US President Trump is going through military bases inside Germany, for example. We have the using of military bases from for the different military missions. For example, in Cyprus there are military bases from Great Britain, and they use it for the military missions of European Union, and so on. I think this question of military bases is one of the main questions the peace movement should look on. How much does it mean, the 2%? In Germany, it would be, in the moment it's 31 34.1 billion. Now it's 37, and it will be 70 billion when it in 2024 when they really do it with 2%. It's nearby impossible. And another number, all the member states of NATO together spend 1 trillion euro for military budget. That means 1,000 billion euro. When you compare, and that was the question, how they bring it to the people, when you compare it, when it would be 70 billion euro in Germany, it would be more than Russia are spending in the moment. And for all what they say is, we need this because we have the enemy Russia. And it's unbelievable because it's something like they use it, the new Cold War against Russia to have more military spending, and always this military spending is going together with cutting of social spending. And so it's very clear, the question of do the people feel secure? Very interesting question. In Germany there have been some polls on this with very unclear answers. There's a big will to have security, but how this security should be solved, it's not clear. I think one answer should be to have a good social security, and when you have this, it's one main step that the people are really secure. And in the moment in Germany they will increase more money for military, more money for police, and we will have the G20 summit in Hamburg, and you will see what they will do there. It's something like this, what happens today in Brussels will be only a few of that what happens in Hamburg. It will be an occupied town for police, because G20, it's in July. Nevertheless, there will be the demonstration and the different movements will mobilize for this, and I hope it will be an international mobilization for the G20 demonstration and counter summit and also all this on. But you see, their answer is more spending in military and police, and our answer should be calling for disarmament and more spending in social security.
Okay, maybe to complete the question of Bert also about what type or how should it be spent, maybe it's important to emphasize again that there is not only the target or the standard of 2% of GDP, but inside the military budget is also a standard, NATO standard. We are supposed, every country is supposed to invest 20% from that money into military equipment. Yeah. For example, Belgium, that's only 5%, 5.5%, and there is a defense plan. They want to even to do better until 25% or 26% even. So it means, in reality, subsidizing the military industry, and military industry, of course, is very happy with this second standard. Okay, I don't know. There may be more questions. Oh, and now, yeah, maybe first because you raised your hand already in the first round. Okay, and then we come back now. Okay. I see it's already, we have only 50 minutes, so please be brief. That's also for the speakers to answer. You don't have to answer all questions, but briefly, please. Thank you.
My name is Karen King, and I'm currently involved in Stop Fueling War, which is a European movement to stop Eurosatory, which is the world's largest air and ground armament sales held every 2 years in Paris. I think I've been a member of all sorts of peace groups for a long, long time, and I think that we are now on the wrong track. I think in order to get public opinion behind us, we need to simplify our message. We can't talk about invest in peace, not in war, because to the average person this means nothing. What we need to do is to say to ourselves or ask ourselves, what is the most frightening thing for most people now, in the West I'm talking about, in the G7 countries, and it is the threat of terrorism. I mean, what happened in Manchester, 22 young people were killed, and that is terrible, terrible. But when I say to other people, yes, we think of the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands who've been killed because of our weapon sales, they look at me blankly and sort of think, oh, what's that got to do with me? So I think what we need to do is to, I hate to use the word capitalize, but to look at what frightens the electorate in these countries, weapons sales countries, and target them and say, this is what the real enemy is, and this is how we can stop it. For example, in Belgium National Day last year, there were so many police around and walking through the area with all the sophisticated weaponry around me. What were the police doing? They were looking in our bags to find out if we had any knives. I could have got my kitchen knife and started stabbing people, and it was nothing. And yet I say this to people, you know, what is it that is important? Is that we link what people are frightened of to, you know, if it's cybercrime, then why aren't we looking at Russia or North Korea or whatever, looking and investing more in cybercrime instead of selling and producing hugely expensive weapons? So that's the first point. And make a direct link, and not be so sophisticated that people have to have a chain of reasoning. If you sell weapons, you get refugees. If you sell weapons, you get terrorism. Why? Because there's so much poverty and alienation in these countries. And if you send out armed drones to kill civilians, it's the best way of creating the next generation of terrorists. Full stop. There isn't an argument about this one. And sorry, can I just make one other point, which is we need to spend some money, serious money, in doing studies on the alternative usage of funding of defense, of weapons. In other words, if you say 100 billion buys you X number of planes or whatever, 100 billion will buy you Y number of doctors, Z number of teachers, whatever, A number of schools. But we haven't had any research on this. We all say this, but we actually can't prove it. And we need some serious studies on these alternative uses. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Saeed. We are talking about the figures and good ideas, but I find that we are expecting that those people who are running the countries, they are going to change anything. I think this is the question. How can we expect Trump to be a peaceful man, or the regime of Trump? It's impossible. How we can expect the UN to be a peaceful organization, institution? They are there for that. So, I mean, if we want to be against the military things, we should think about our power. We should take the power. I really cannot understand how bargaining about the figures, instead of 30 million for military, let's do 10 million and the rest for social. They are not doing that. Look at the refugees and immigrants. The door is open. These victims of the war, They are taking them to the military and to the police. They're making them the soldier of the system. So we should change the system and the runners of the system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Carol. I'm from the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the UK. I'm a vice chair, and I want to adopt Inga's suggestion, which is we talk broadly in this session and we talk in detail in the second session. That makes more sense to me. I wanted to pick up on the point that Tobias made in his introduction about the attempt by the United States to push the burden, the financial burden, onto Europe and the Allies. Because of course this is not simply something which has come in the last few years. This has been present throughout the post-war period. Looked at from the United States government's point of view, NATO, which is part of the structure which determine US hegemony and global leadership, that is the political purpose. It's not simply a military purpose. And if you look at the figures from virtually from 45 onwards, certainly from the end of the 50s onwards, it is always the case that the United States has paid the majority burden of NATO. In fact, it's the global trend of defence spending, with one or two exceptions, has dropped from the end of the 80s. From, I can't remember the global figures. In Britain, we've gone from about 5% spending in the early 90s to now spending around 2%. So I think it's not sufficient for us simply to have a series of arithmetical additions and arrive at a policy. We have to look at the strategic direction of things, and in my opinion understand that the politics which apply is that NATO helps to maintain the hegemony of the American system. And if you look at it from the opposite point of view, from the point of view of the European allies, the purpose of NATO is not simply as a military club, collective defence as NATO would have us believe, but it's a way in which they maintain the status within the international community. You can see this very clearly in Britain. Perhaps there will be some opportunity to talk about the specifics of Britain in another session. But I think if we're planning what to do in the future around raising the issue, it's very important to give it a political and not, excuse me, and not simply an arithmetical context. Thank you.
One question, more question there, and then it's first minute. D'abord,
I'll be very brief. Lynn Boylan, a member of the European Parliament from Ireland, and as someone who campaigned against the Lisbon Treaty for the very reasons that Tobias was pointing out, it's very, very difficult for a neutral country, and unfortunately we've a complicit media in Ireland that said we were scaremongering. And now, as being a member of the European Parliament, it was just to add a couple of points to what Tobias was saying. The last report that passed in the European Parliament, which I think was 2 months ago in Strasbourg, it called for the 2%, but it was quite specific about what it wanted to be spent on. So it wasn't about protecting, as in the case of Ireland, your coastal. It's about weapons and research. But they're also calling for its own budget, which would be then on top of this 2%. The EU wants a budget of its own right that member states pay into. And they also are trying to figure out a way to divert the development money into security spending as well. So the 2% is a figure, but behind that 2% there's a much larger figure as well that's at hand. And the problem is that nobody is really discussing the EU, and I suppose NATO, we're not in NATO in Ireland, so it's very hard to talk about it in Ireland. Well, what we do need is to have the conversation about EU reform, and I think it would be a way of then also putting what's happening in NATO on the agenda. If you can reform the EU and its militarisation, I think that would be a huge step.
Okay, thank you. I think it's the 5 billion fund that has been decided last week, isn't it? 5 billion military fund they are creating now. It has been decided only recently, I think.
George Baker, Amsterdam, Tobias. My information was from a member of parliament that it's half of the debt of Greece, and it's into the hands of the German arms industry where all the money has gone. But you never hear that about in the media. One more point. First was private debt, and then it went into state debt of Greece. Second point, every officer is trained in false flag operations. Now in '89 in Berlin there was a little problem with capitalism because communism was defeated, the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we needed a new enemy to replace the Russians, and we found Muslims. So we bombed the Twin Towers and the Pentagon to have Muslims as more sustainable enemy. Please comment.
We have 3 minutes left. We stick to the. I think with the beautiful weather, each of us would like to do a little bit sun bathing. Smoke a cigarette underneath it. Okay.
Yeah. So we will discuss further in the next session, I hope. Asking for a study on comparison between military and social expenditure. I think it is extremely important, and it was done in a substantial way for many years by an American lady called Ruth Leitchard Sievert, and unfortunately she is not able to do that work anymore, and several of the peace organizations are doing bits and pieces of it, and you might want to look into IPB's website, ipbw.org, for more information on that. Then maybe we need a discussion on democracy, because when you say that we should take the leading position, we the people, how do we do that? Because the people have been called upon, and they have come up with some strange decision as to who should be our leaders these days. Thank you.
First, when you say we have to fight for the power, I totally agree. That's the reason why I'm not only in the peace movement, but I'm also a member of a party inside Germany to fight that we have a strong opposition there. So that would be my answer. I don't know if it is possible for all. I think the point was very important, what is going on inside the European Union. I totally agree with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who says there should be a total new negotiations of all treaties of European Union. And because this Lisbon Treaty is a military treaty, it's also an unsocial treaty and a neoliberal treaty, but it's absolutely clear that on the base of this treaties inside the European Union, a peaceful European Union isn't possible. So for me it's absolutely clear that we have, it was good that we fight together in the referendums in Ireland 2 times, in France and in Netherlands, and there was a lot of reasons why we win 3 times, and this EU bureaucrats together with the governments of the strong states like Germany have had their reasons why they make all these tricks for this treaty what is in power now inside the European Union. So we have to fight for other treaties. And the last one, when we discuss on a simple way how NATO is acting in the moment, you can bring it to the easy analysis. They are preparing more and more armament and all this against Russia and against refugees. Because when you look to a lot of military missions, NATO and European Union inside the Mediterranean Sea, you see it's official not against refugees, but in reality it's against refugees. And I think we should have this debate, what you mentioned before. We are in favor for helping the refugees, but we have to ask the questions why they have to flee from their lands. And this is because of the policy, including the policy of NATO. And we should say very clear that there is a main reason, special what I told before about weapon production, also all these military missions. And we should say very clear in the debate that this is one of the reasons why these people have to flee, and we have it concrete. In a lot of cases we can say very clear, because you sell the weapons there, they destroy, and then they have to flee. So it's very clear, and for me, I think this question of NATO, and we should be also very clear in the naming. What is NATO? It's a war machine, it's an institution. The main issue of this NATO is to organize wars, and that's the reason why we are against.
Okay, thank you very much for these words, the last words. It's time for lunch, and thank you also for the translators, because they have been translating now for 3 hours already. Thank you very much. Also, there is a second part of this workshop, this special session where we are supposed to look more deeply into strategy. We already talked a little bit about strategies, what should the peace movement do, but there we really would like to focus what can we do, and we will have hopefully examples of campaigns connected to this question of the military spending. So see you back at 2:50. Thank you very much.